What would you do if everything you built was destroyed in a single night? When Morgan Reynolds lost her husband, she poured her grief into building an observatory that connected her to the stars they both loved. But when a ruthless gang destroys her life's work, they have no idea they've crossed paths with a woman who can navigate the wilderness using only the night sky. This is the story of how one woman's extraordinary knowledge became her path to survival and justice in the unforgiving mountains of Montana. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first stars of evening pierced the twilight sky as Morgan Reynolds stood among the smoking ruins of her observatory. Ash clung to her boots and the hem of her jacket as she knelt to retrieve a fragment of her husband's custom-built telescope, now nothing more than twisted metal and shattered glass. The cool mountain air carried the acrid scent of burnt wood and plastic, a constant reminder of what she had lost. Just 24 hours earlier, the observatory had stood proudly on this ridge, a gleaming white dome that caught the last light of day as the sun slipped behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. It had been her sanctuary for 3 years since David's death, the place where she felt closest to him and to the stars they had spent their lives studying together. Morgan's fingers closed around the brass eyepiece, the only salvageable piece of the telescope. The metal was still warm. Behind her, the sounds of her 2 teenage children rummaging through what remained of their research station echoed across the clearing. "Mom, the hard drives are gone," called Leah, her daughter's voice cracking with barely contained fury. At 17, Leah had inherited her father's analytical mind and her mother's stubbornness. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, streaks of soot marking her face. "They took everything, all our data, Dad's star charts, everything." Morgan closed her eyes, steadying herself before turning to face her daughter. "What about the backup drive? Is the one on the floor safe?" "They found it," said Jake, appearing from behind a collapsed wall. At 15, he was already taller than Morgan, his lanky frame silhouetted against the fading light. They knew exactly where to look. Someone told them. Morgan's jaw tightened. The Blackwell gang. It had to be. The same men who had been pressuring her to sell the land for months, claiming they needed the access road for their mining operation. Everyone in Pine Ridge country knew the Blackwells weren't miners. They were dealers who used the remote mountain passes to move their product across state lines. "What are we going to do now?" Leah asked, her voice smaller than it had been in years. "The research grant is tied to this facility," Morgan finished, her voice hollow. "I know. The research grant had been their lifeline after David's death. A prestigious award from the National Science Foundation to continue their work, mapping previously uncharted star patterns. The observatory had been built with those funds, a condition of the grant. Without it, there would be no renewal next quarter. No money for the mortgage on their house in the valley below. No college fund for Leah, who was supposed to start at Caltech next fall." Morgan looked up at the emerging stars, orienting herself as she had done thousands of times before. Polaris was just becoming visible, a steady point in a world that had suddenly lost all stability. "We need to pack up what we can and go back to the house," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "We'll figure this out." But when they reached the winding dirt road where their truck was parked, they found only glass scattered across the ground. The vehicle was gone. "They took our truck?" Jake kicked at the dirt, his frustration finally boiling over. "How are we supposed to get down the mountain? It's a 15-mile hike." Morgan checked her phone. No signal as expected. They were too far up, too remote. That had been the point. An observatory needed clear skies, away from light pollution and civilization. "We'll hike down to the Miller property," she said, calculating the distance in her head. 5 miles east. They have a landline we can use to call Sheriff Donnelly." 5 miles in the dark? Leah looked skeptical, glancing at the deepening twilight. Morgan's hand went to the brass eyepiece in her pocket, her fingers tracing its familiar contours. "I spent 20 years mapping the stars with your father. I can navigate us 5 miles in the dark." As if in answer, a rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. Morgan looked west to see heavy clouds gathering, obscuring the stars that had just begun to shine. A storm was coming. Of course it was. "We need to move," she said, shouldering her backpack, the one she always kept stocked with emergency supplies. "Now!" They set off along the ridge, Morgan leading with a determined stride. Her mind raced, analyzing their situation with the same precision she applied to her astronomical calculations. The Blackwells had planned this carefully, destroying the observatory, stealing their data, taking their only transportation. They wanted the Reynolds family gone, or at least intimidated enough to sell the land. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall as they entered the tree line. The forest was dense here, old-growth pines blocking what little light remained in the sky. Morgan pulled a small flashlight from her pack, keeping it pointed at the ground to preserve their night vision. "Mom?" Jake's voice came from behind her, uncharacteristically uncertain. "What if the Blackwells are still out here?" Morgan didn't slow her pace. "They got what they wanted. They're probably celebrating in some bar by now." But she wasn't certain. Something about this attack felt different, more personal than just business intimidation. Sheriff Donnelly had warned her that Vince Blackwell wasn't a man who took rejection well. When Morgan had refused to sell the observatory land for the 3rd time last month, the sheriff had suggested she consider hiring security. "We couldn't afford security," she had told him. "Besides, this is scientific research, not Fort Knox." Now, as they pushed deeper into the forest with rain soaking through their clothes, Morgan bitterly regretted her confidence. The storm intensified, the drumming of rain on leaves drowning out their footsteps. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the path ahead and the steep drop to their right. This route was dangerous in daylight. In a storm, it was treacherous. "Maybe we should find shelter until this passes," Leah suggested, having to raise her voice over the wind. Morgan hesitated, then nodded. "There's a rock overhang about 1/2 mile ahead. We can wait it out there." But as they rounded the next bend, Morgan stopped abruptly, throwing out an arm to halt her children. Through the curtain of rain, the beam of her flashlight caught a reflection that shouldn't have been there, metallic, unnatural. "Get down!" she whispered, pulling Leah and Jake into the underbrush beside the trail. Not 20 yards ahead, barely visible through the downpour, stood a black SUV parked across the narrow path. A man leaned against the hood, the glow of a cigarette. Briefly illuminating a face Morgan recognized instantly, Ryan Blackwell, Vince's youngest son, the most volatile of the bunch. Morgan's heart hammered in her chest. The overhang she'd been heading for was just beyond that vehicle. The Blackwells knew these mountains too. They had anticipated her escape route. "Is there another way?" Jake whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Morgan looked up, but the storm clouds had swallowed the stars. Her celestial compass was gone. She closed her eyes, visualizing the topographical maps she had memorized when they first built the observatory. There was another path, an old game, trail that cut sharply down the eastern slope, eventually connecting with Miller Creek. It was steep, unmarked, and dangerous even in daylight, but it was their only option. "Yes," she whispered back, already calculating their new route. "But we need to move carefully. Follow me, and step exactly where I step." As they retreated silently into the darkness of the forest, Morgan felt a strange calm settling over her. The observatory was gone, their research was stolen, but they were alive, and she still had the knowledge that no one could take from her, the ability to find her way using nothing but the stars and her own determination. What the Blackwells didn't understand was that they hadn't destroyed her greatest asset. They had merely forced her to use it, Lightning flickered through the branches as Morgan led her children away from the path, plunging deeper into the forest. The game trail she sought was barely visible in the darkness, a slight depression in the undergrowth, marked only by the absence of larger plants. Her fingers closed around the brass eyepiece in her pocket, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. "Stay low," she whispered, gesturing for Jake and Leah to crouch beside her. They were still too close to the SUV. Another flash of lightning illuminated. Two more figures joining Ryan Blackwell, men with rifles slung across their backs. "They're hunting us," Leah breathed, her voice barely audible over the rain. Morgan nodded grimly, "which means we need to disappear." The rain had saturated the forest floor, turning the soil to slick mud that threatened to pull their boots off with each step. Morgan's jeans were soaked through, heavy and cold against her skin. She could hear Jake's teeth chattering behind her, but there was no time to stop and rest. The Blackwells knew these mountains almost as well as she did. Almost. The difference was that the Blackwells used the mountains to hide their operations. Morgan had studied them, mapped them, measured them, used them to frame her view of the stars. She knew every ridge and valley within 10 miles of the observatory, not just as landmarks, but as calculable points in a cosmic alignment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Here," she murmured, stopping at a nearly vertical slope. In daylight, it would have been an intimidating descent. In the storm-black night, it looked impossible. "We need to go down. Watch your footing and use the trees to brace yourselves." "Mom, we can't," Jake began, but Morgan was already moving, finding handholds on exposed roots and rocks. "We can," she said firmly. "We have to." The descent was brutal. The rain had turned the slope into a mudslide, and more than once, Morgan felt her feet go out from under her. She slid several yards before managing to grab a sapling, her palms burning with the friction. Behind her she heard Leah gasp as she slipped, then the dull thud as Jake caught her. They were halfway down when a beam of light cut through the trees above them, a powerful flashlight sweeping the ridge they had just left. "Down!" Morgan hissed, pressing herself flat against the mud. Jake and Leah followed suit, their dark clothing blending with the sodden earth. The light passed over them once, twice, then moved on. "They don't know which way we went," Jake whispered, hope creeping into his voice for the first time that night. "Yet," Morgan corrected. "We need to keep moving." By the time they reached the bottom of the slope, the storm had begun to ease. Ribbons of sky appeared between the clouds, and Morgan felt a surge of relief as the first stars became visible. She paused, orienting herself by the position of Cassiopeia. "Miller Creek should be a quarter-mile that way," she said, pointing southeast. "If we follow it downstream, we'll reach their property." They pushed forward, their pace painfully slow. "Now!" Exhaustion was settling in, making each step a conscious effort. Morgan watched her children with growing concern. Leah's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line against the pain of what looked like a twisted ankle. Jake kept swiping. Rain from his eyes, his shoulders hunched with fatigue. The creek appeared as a dark ribbon cutting through the forest, its waters swollen and rushing with the recent downpour. Morgan knelt beside it, letting the cold water wash the mud from her hands. "We can't cross here," she said, studying the current. "It's too dangerous. We'll have to follow it down until—" A distant crack echoed through the trees, unmistakably. "A gunshot. They're still looking," Leah whispered, her eyes wide. Morgan made a quick decision. "Change of plans. We need to find shelter now, somewhere we can hide until morning." She scanned the creek bank, her practiced eye seeking any anomaly. In the landscape, there, a dark shadow beneath an outcropping of rock, partially hidden by a fallen tree. It might be nothing, or it might be the entrance to a small cave. Either way, it offered concealment. "This way," she said, leading them toward the outcropping. It was indeed a cave, shallow but deep enough to provide shelter from both the elements and searching eyes. Morgan ushered her children inside, then carefully arranged branches across the entrance to further conceal it. Inside, she finally allowed herself to take stock of their situation. They were 5 miles from the observatory, probably 3 from the Miller property. They had no vehicle, no phone, and were being actively hunted by armed men. Their home in the valley was 15 miles away, a full day's hike under good conditions. "What do we have?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the desperation clawing at her throat. Jake emptied his pockets. A Swiss Army knife, a half-eaten protein bar, his student ID card. Leah had her wallet with $37, a hairband, and her father's old compass, a gift from Morgan on her 16th birthday. Morgan took inventory of her own emergency pack. A small first aid kit, the flashlight, a lighter, a space blanket, a water bottle, and a handful of granola bars. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We should try to sleep," she said, unfolding the space blanket. "Take shifts watching. I'll go first." "What happens in the morning?" Jake asked, huddling close to his sister under the metallic blanket. "The Blackwells aren't just going to give up." Morgan didn't have a good answer. The Blackwells had clearly escalated beyond intimidation tactics. Destroying property was one thing. Hunting people through the wilderness with guns was something else. Entirely something that hinted at desperation. "What did Dad's research show?" she asked suddenly, turning to Leah. "The anomalies in the star charts. What did they indicate?" Leah frowned, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "The gravitational distortions. They suggested some kind of dense material. Dad thought it might be evidence of a mineral deposit." "A mineral deposit," Morgan repeated slowly, "directly under our land." Understanding dawned on Leah's face. "You think that's why the Blackwells want our property? For mining rights?" "Not for their usual business," Morgan said, thinking aloud. "For something potentially much more valuable, something worth millions if they could extract it." "But we didn't publish those findings," Jake pointed out. "How would they know?" Morgan's mind raced through possibilities. Someone at the university where she'd submitted the grant renewal paperwork, a staff member at the NSF who had access to their preliminary data, or someone closer, one of the local contractors who had helped build additions to the observatory. "Someone told them," she said grimly, "and they're not going to stop coming after us until they have those mineral rights." Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Through the concealed entrance of their shelter, Morgan could see stars emerging in greater numbers. The familiar patterns calmed her racing thoughts, grounding her in what she knew to be constant and true. "Get some sleep," she told her children. "We leave at first light." As Jake and Leah drifted into exhausted slumber, Morgan kept watch, her mind meticulously crafting a plan. They couldn't go back to their home in the valley. That would be the first place the Blackwells would look. They couldn't go to the sheriff in Pine Ridge, not without evidence of what the Blackwells had done, and not when she suspected someone in town had betrayed them. Their options were limited, but not non-existent. 50 miles north, in Missoula, lived Dr. Eleanor Martinez, her former academic advisor and one of the few people Morgan still trusted implicitly. If they could reach Eleanor, they would have a safe place to regroup and figure out their next steps. But getting to Missoula meant crossing the most rugged section of the Bitterroot Range, navigating remote wilderness without maps or equipment. It meant keeping her children safe from both the elements and the men hunting them. Morgan's hand found the brass eyepiece again, her fingers tracing the engraving David had added before gifting it to her on their 10th anniversary. Ad astra per aspera, through hardship to the stars. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she had used the stars to chart courses through space. Now she would use them to chart a course through wilderness toward safety. Outside their hiding place, a twig snapped. Morgan froze, her hand instinctively moving to cover the flashlight. Through the branches concealing the entrance, she could make out the beam of a powerful light sweeping the creek bank, not 20 yards away. The Blackwells had found their trail. Morgan pressed her finger to her lips, silencing Jake, who had started to stir. The beam of light swept across the creek again, closer this time. She could hear voices now, low, urgent murmurs carried on the night air. "Tracks lead this way," a gruff voice said. "Can't have gone far in this terrain." "Vince wants them found by sunrise," another replied. "Says the woman knows too much." Morgan's mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden. The Blackwells were methodically searching the area and would eventually discover their shelter. But moving now, with flashlights scanning the darkness, would be equally dangerous. She looked up through a small gap in the rock ceiling. The clouds had mostly cleared, revealing a tapestry of stars. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, its pointer stars aimed at Polaris. West of it, she could just make out Cassiopeia's distinctive W shape. A plan formed in her mind, risky but better than waiting to be discovered. Gently, she shook Leah and Jake awake, covering their mouths before they could speak. She pointed to the lights outside, then to a narrow crevice at the back of their shallow cave. "There's another way out," she mouthed silently. "Follow me." The crevice was tight, barely wide enough for Jake's shoulders, but it opened into a narrow ravine that cut away from the creek. Morgan led the way, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid displacing rocks or snapping twigs. Behind her, Leah and Jake mimicked her movements, their faces tense with concentration. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when a shout echoed behind them. "Over here! Found a hideout!" "Run," Morgan whispered, abandoning stealth for speed. "Stay in the ravine." They scrambled forward, slipping on wet stone and grabbing at exposed roots to keep their balance. The ravine deepened, its walls rising. On either side, in the darkness, it was impossible to see what lay ahead, whether the path continued or dropped off into nothingness. Morgan reached out, feeling the space before her with outstretched hands. The ravine was narrowing, its floor beginning to slope upward. Good. It would lead them back to higher ground, away from the creek where the Blackwells were searching. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced erratically as their pursuers discovered the crevice. Morgan estimated they had maybe 2 minutes before. The men followed their trail. "Here," she gasped, finding a place where tree roots had created natural handholds in the ravine wall. "We can climb out." The climb was brutal. Their hands, already raw from the earlier descent, now burned with fresh pain as they hauled themselves upward. Jake went first, then reached back to help Leah, whose injured ankle was clearly worsening. Morgan came last, constantly glancing over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. They reached the top, just as voices echoed in the ravine below. Without pausing to rest, Morgan led them into the dense forest, away from the sound of their hunters. For an hour, they pushed forward, changing direction frequently to confuse any trail they might be leaving. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth, scratching at their clothes and skin. Twice they had to backtrack when fallen trees blocked their path. Finally, when Morgan was certain they had lost their pursuers, she allowed them to stop. They collapsed onto the damp forest floor, breathing heavily, every muscle aching with fatigue. "Where are we?" Jake asked between gulps of air. Morgan oriented herself by the stars, visible now in patches through the forest canopy. "About 2 miles northeast of our original position," she said. "We're heading in the right direction for Missoula, but we've lost the trail." "Is that good or bad?" Leah whispered, massaging her swollen ankle. "Good for losing the Blackwells, bad for making time." Morgan knelt beside her daughter, gently examining the injury. "How bad is it?" Leah winced. "I can walk, just not fast." Morgan nodded, trying to hide her concern. They needed to cover at least 10 miles before the next nightfall to stay ahead of their pursuers, and Leah's injury would slow them considerably. She dug through her emergency pack and found a small roll of athletic tape. "This will help stabilize it," she said, carefully wrapping Leah's ankle. "Jake, take out the granola bars. We all need to eat something." They divided the meager rations, half a bar each, saving the rest for later. Morgan passed the water bottle, allowing each of them just a few sips. Conservation was critical now. They had no idea when they'd find another water source, and dehydration in the wilderness could be deadly. "What's the plan?" Jake asked, his voice steadier now that he had food in his stomach. Morgan looked up at the stars again, her mind calculating. "Distances and terrain features. We need to reach Black Hawk Ridge by tomorrow night," she said. "From there, we can follow the old fire road toward Highway 12. If we can reach the highway, we might be able to flag down a ride to Missoula." "That's at least 20 miles, Leah pointed out, her face pale in the starlight. 23, Morgan corrected, "and we need to do it without being seen." They rested for 30 minutes, then continued their journey through the moonlit forest. Morgan set a sustainable pace, conscious of Leah's injury and their need to conserve energy. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed away from the river valley, the forest thinning slightly as pine and fir gave way to mountain scrub. By the time dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in pale gold, they had covered nearly 4 miles. Not enough, but a start. Morgan found a sheltered outcropping where they could rest during the most dangerous hours, daylight, when they would be most visible to searchers. "Try to sleep," she told her children. "I'll keep watch." But sleep proved elusive. Every snapping twig, every bird call made them flinch. The morning sun brought no warmth to their damp clothes, and hunger gnawed at their empty stomachs. Morgan scanned their surroundings, assessing their resources. Water was the most urgent need. They had finished the last drops hours ago, and dehydration would weaken them quickly. Food was secondary but still critical. "Jake," she said, "your father taught you which berries are safe, didn't he?" Jake nodded. David had been passionate about wilderness survival, insisting that his children learn the basics despite living in a modern world of convenience. It had seemed excessive then. Now it might save their lives. "I'm going to look for water. You search for edibles within sight of this spot. Leah, rest that ankle and keep watch." Morgan moved carefully through the underbrush, alert for any sign of moisture. The recent rain should have left pockets of water, even at this elevation. She found what she was looking for in a cluster of rocks, a small depression filled with relatively clear rainwater. Using the empty water bottle and a bandana from her pack as a crude filter, she collected as much as she could. It wasn't ideal, but it would sustain them. Returning to their temporary camp, she found Jake had collected a handful of wild huckleberries and some pine nuts. Not much, but combined with their remaining granola bar halves, it would give them enough energy to continue. As they ate this sparse breakfast, Morgan took stock of their situation. Their most immediate needs, water, food, and temporary shelter, had been addressed, but the challenges ahead were daunting, navigating through unfamiliar sections of the mountain range, avoiding the Blackwells, who would certainly have called in reinforcements by now, and keeping Leah mobile despite her injury. Then there was the matter of evidence. Even if they reached Missoula safely, they would need proof of the Blackwells' crimes to get any help from authorities. Without it, it would be their word against a family with deep connections throughout the county. "Mom?" Jake's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I saved something from the observatory." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black device, a backup flash drive, the kind Morgan insisted they update weekly with their most important data. "I grabbed it when we were looking through the ruins," he explained. "I don't know if it still works, but—" Morgan took the drive with trembling fingers. If it contained the star charts that had revealed the mineral deposit under their land, it might be enough to explain the Blackwells' sudden interest and extreme measures. "Jake, this could be our lifeline," she said, carefully securing the drive in her own zippered pocket. But it also makes it even more important that we reach Missoula safely. The Blackwells can't know we have this." The sun climbed higher, its heat beginning to seep through the forest canopy. They would need to wait until dusk before moving again. Movement in daylight was too risky. Morgan leaned back against the rock face, allowing herself a moment of rest. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp, plotting their course through the wilderness by the mental map of stars she carried within her. She looked at her children, Jake determinedly fashioning a walking stick for his sister, Leah cataloguing the meager contents of their pockets one more time. Despite everything, pride swelled in her chest. They were David's children through and through, resourceful, resilient. They would make it to Missoula, they had to. There was no other option now. Dusk settled over the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Morgan roused her, children from their fitful rest. The day's hiding had given them a chance to recover some strength, but Leah's ankle had stiffened and hunger had become a constant companion. "We need to cover at least 6 miles tonight," Morgan said, helping Leah to her feet. "The terrain gets rougher from here." They set off in the fading light, Morgan leading the way through the increasingly rocky landscape. The forest was thinning as they climbed higher, giving way to scrub and exposed stone. This made navigation easier. The stars were more visible, but also left them more exposed. Jake supported Leah on one side, the walking stick he'd fashioned bracing her on the other. They moved slowly but steadily, each step carefully placed on the uneven ground. "Listen," Morgan whispered, freezing in place. In the distance, the faint sound of engines echoed through the mountains. "ATVs. They've brought in more search teams." Jake's face tightened. "How far?" "Maybe 2 miles west," Morgan estimated, orienting herself by sound. "They're searching the valley, systematic." Her words cut off as a beam of light swept across the ridge to their right. A powerful spotlight mounted. On a vehicle, they dropped to the ground, pressing themselves against the rocky soil. "Change of plan," Morgan breathed as the light moved on. "We need higher ground. Somewhere those vehicles can't follow." She adjusted their course, leading them toward a steeper section of the mountain that rose like a wall before them. It would be a difficult climb, especially for Leah, but the rugged terrain would provide both cover and safety from mechanized pursuers. The climb was grueling. What little energy they had regained during the day was quickly depleted as they hauled themselves up the rocky slope. Leah bit her lip against the pain, refusing to slow them down. But Morgan saw the tears tracking silently down her daughter's face. Halfway up, they found an unexpected blessing, a small spring seeping from the rock face, creating a trickle of clear water. They refilled their bottle and drank deeply, the cold water reviving their flagging spirits. "Dad would have loved this," Jake said suddenly, gazing up at the brilliant canopy of stars above them. "Best view in Montana." Morgan smiled, her heart aching at the mention of David. He always said the best observatories were the ones you had to work to reach. They continued, upward, finding a rhythm in their movements. The sounds of engines faded as they climbed, replaced by the whisper of wind through sparse pines and the occasional call of a night bird. Near midnight, they reached a small plateau jutting from the mountainside. Morgan called a halt, knowing they needed rest before tackling the final section. "We're making good time," she told them, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "Another hour, and we'll reach the ridgeline." Jake nodded, easing Leah down onto a flat rock. Even in the dim starlight, Morgan could see the exhaustion etched on their faces. They needed more than just rest. They needed proper food, medical attention for Leah's ankle, and safety from the men hunting them. As Jake helped Leah stretch her injured leg, Morgan moved to the edge of the plateau, scanning their surroundings. The valley below was dark, with only occasional pinpricks of light betraying the presence of search vehicles. Beyond it, the mountain range stretched like a frozen ocean, peaks and valleys extending to the horizon. Something caught her eye. A steady light where no light should be, high on the opposite ridge. Not the sweeping beam of a spotlight or the bouncing glow of a flashlight, but a fixed point of illumination. "Jake," she called softly, "bring me the binoculars from my pack." She focused the compact field glasses on the distant light. It was a window, a single illuminated window in what appeared to be a small structure perched on the ridge. "What is it?" Jake asked, joining her. "A cabin," Morgan replied, adjusting the focus. "Probably a fire lookout or a ranger station." Hope surged through her. If it was a ranger station, it would have communications equipment, a radio at minimum, possibly even a satellite phone. And supplies, medical kits, food, proper maps. "How far?" Leah asked, limping over to join them. Morgan calculated, measuring the distance against known landmarks. 4 miles as the crow flies, probably 6 with the terrain we'd have to cross. "That's another full night of travel," Jake said, glancing at his sister's swollen ankle. Morgan weighed their options. Continuing toward Missoula meant at least 2 more days of travel in their current condition, with the Blackwells actively hunting them. The cabin represented a closer refuge, potentially with resources they desperately needed. "We change course," she decided. "Head for the cabin." They rested for an hour, then began the final climb to the ridgeline. From there, they would need to descend into the valley between the mountains before climbing again to reach the distant cabin. The going was slow, each step a test of endurance. Morgan found herself drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, fueled by the need to keep her children moving forward. Leah had stopped complaining about her ankle hours ago, a sign that worried Morgan more than her earlier years. Dawn was breaking as they reached the ridgeline, painting the eastern sky in pink and gold. Below them, the valley was shrouded in morning mist, ethereal and strangely beautiful despite their circumstances. "We need to find cover for the day," Morgan said, scanning the ridge for suitable shelter. "We can't risk crossing the valley in daylight." Jake pointed to a cluster of boulders with a natural overhang. "There?" It wasn't ideal, more exposed than Morgan would have liked, but it would shield them from casual observation. They made their way to the rocks and huddled beneath the overhang, sharing the last of their water and the few berries Jake had collected during their climb. "Get some sleep," Morgan told her children. "I'll keep watch." But sleep proved elusive in the growing light. Every distant sound might be a search party. Every shadow might conceal a threat. Morgan found herself staring at the cabin across the valley, tantalizingly close, yet still hours away. Who occupied it? A forest ranger? A seasonal worker? A private owner? Whoever it was represented both potential help and potential danger. Not everyone in these mountains would welcome strangers, especially strangers being hunted by the Blackwells, whose influence extended throughout the county. As the morning wore on, Morgan noticed something odd about the cabin. There was no movement, no sign of occupation beyond that single illuminated window. No smoke from a chimney, no figure moving around outside. "Jake," she whispered, passing him the binoculars. "What do you see in the cabin?" He studied it for a long moment. "Nothing, no one's moving around. Maybe they're asleep." "Maybe," Morgan agreed, though doubt nagged at her. Something wasn't right. They spent the day in uneasy rest, taking turns keeping watch. The search vehicles hadn't appeared in this section of the mountains yet, but Morgan knew it was only a matter of time. The Blackwells were nothing if not thorough. The afternoon waned. Morgan made a decision. "We're not waiting for full darkness. We'll move at dusk, cross the valley, and reach the cabin before midnight." The plan had risks, but Leah's condition was deteriorating. The girl's face was flushed, with the beginning of fever, likely infection setting into her injured ankle. They needed the medical supplies that might be waiting at the cabin. When the sun dipped below the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, they began their descent. The slope was gentler on this side, allowing them to move more. Quickly, despite Leah's injury, Morgan kept them within the tree line whenever possible, using the lengthening shadows for concealment. They were halfway across the valley floor when Morgan spotted the tracks, ATV trails, fresh enough that the disturbed earth hadn't yet settled. "The Blackwells have been here," she whispered, crouching to examine the churned soil. "Recently?" Jake's face paled. "Are they still around?" Morgan shook her head, unsure. "I don't think so. These tracks head back toward the main road. But we need to be careful." They continued with heightened caution, moving from cover to cover, freezing at every unusual sound. The valley seemed impossibly wide now, the distant cabin a tiny speck of light in the gathering darkness. It was Jake who spotted it first, a glint of metal in the underbrush, incongruous among the natural surroundings. He tugged at Morgan's sleeve and pointed. Cautiously they approached. Half hidden by bushes and covered with a camouflage tarp was an ATV. Abandoned or hidden, it was impossible to tell. "It looks intact," Jake whispered, examining it without touching. "Keys are gone." Though Morgan's mind raced, the vehicle represented both opportunity and risk. If they could start it, they could cover the remaining distance to the cabin in minutes rather than hours. But the noise would alert anyone in the vicinity to their presence. "Check under the seat," she instructed. "Sometimes there's a spare key." Jake carefully lifted the seat, revealing a small storage compartment. No key, but something else. A first aid kit, a canteen of water, and a small box of emergency rations. "Someone left in a hurry," Leah observed, eyeing the supplies with frank hunger. Morgan nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "Or someone cached these supplies deliberately." "Like a ranger," Jake suggested. "Maybe." Morgan studied the ATV more closely. No insignia, no markings to indicate it belonged to Forest Service or park rangers, just a well-maintained vehicle with essential supplies. "Take the first aid kit and water," she decided. "Leave the rations. We don't want whoever owns this to know we've been here." As Jake carefully extracted the medical supplies, Morgan's gaze returned to the distant cabin. The single light still burned in the window, a beacon in the deepening twilight. For the first time since fleeing the burning observatory, Morgan felt the stirring of real hope. They had survived the initial flight, found water, discovered the ATV with its precious medical supplies, and identified a potential sanctuary. The odds were still stacked against them, but they were survivors. And now they had a destination. Night had fully descended by the time they reached the base of the ridge where the cabin perched. The first aid kit from the ATV had provided antiseptic wipes and bandages for Leah's ankle, temporarily holding the infection at bay. The clean water had revived their strength, but exhaustion still dragged at their limbs as they began the final climb. "Stay low," Morgan whispered as they approached the rocky slope. "We don't know who's up there." The path to the cabin was steeper than it had appeared from a distance, forcing them to use hands and feet to scramble upward. Sharp stones cut into their palms, and more than once they dislodged small cascades of pebbles that clattered down the hillside, each sound amplified in the night stillness. Halfway up, Morgan called a halt behind a jutting boulder. They huddled in its shadow, catching their breath while she studied the cabin above. The single window still glowed with unwavering light, but there was still no sign of movement, no additional lights, no smoke from the chimney. "It doesn't feel right," she murmured. "A cabin this remote should have a generator for power. I don't hear one." Jake frowned. "Solar panels, maybe? Battery power?" "Possible," Morgan conceded. "But there's something else." She narrowed her eyes, focusing on the quality of the light. It wasn't the warm yellow of an oil lamp or the harsh white of modern LEDs. It had a peculiar blue-green tint. "We need to be careful," she decided. Jake, you stay with Leah behind this rock. I'm going to scout ahead. Both children began to protest simultaneously, but Morgan silenced them with a raised hand. It's not negotiable. If something happens to me, you two head back down to the valley, find the ATV and try to start it. Even without keys, your father showed you how to hotwire an engine, didn't he? Jake nodded reluctantly. Use it to get to Highway 12, then flag down help. Understood? Yes, they chorused, neither looking happy about the plan. Morgan removed the flashlight and pocket knife from her pack, tucking them into her jacket. I'll be back soon. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, don't wait for me. She moved forward alone, keeping low to the ground, using natural cover whenever possible. As she drew closer to the cabin, details became clearer. It was smaller than she'd initially thought. A single-room structure with weathered wooden walls and a metal roof. A narrow porch wrapped around one side, and a small shed stood a few yards away. Most telling was what she didn't see. No vehicle, no footprints in the dusty ground surrounding the structure, no woodpile for the stove, whose chimney pipe protruded from the roof. Morgan circled the cabin at a distance, studying it from all angles. The blue-green light emanated from a single window on the east side. The door on the south wall appeared closed, but not necessarily locked. Steeling herself, she approached the door. The porch boards creaked beneath her weight, despite her attempt at silence. She paused, listening for any reaction from inside. Nothing. The door handle turned easily under her hand, and the hinges swung inward without a sound, recently oiled then. Morgan tensed, ready to retreat if necessary, but the cabin's interior remained silent. She slipped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The source of the blue-green light became immediately apparent. A marine emergency. Beacon sat on a table in the center of the room, its light rotating slowly in a preset pattern. Not a cabin light at all, but a distress signal. The cabin itself was sparsely furnished, a small wood stove against one wall, a narrow cot in the corner, a table and 2 chairs, and shelves holding various supplies. Everything was neat, organized, and undisturbed by recent use. A fine layer of dust covered most surfaces, except for the table where the beacon sat. Morgan approached it cautiously. The device was military-grade, designed to operate for weeks on a single battery. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper with a single word written on the outside. Reynolds, her own name. With trembling fingers, Morgan unfolded the note. If you're reading this, you found the beacon. Good. You'll need what I've left. The Blackwells have connections in Missoula PD. Don't trust official channels. Supplies in the root cellar. I'm tracking the men following you. We'll find you when it's safe. L. Morgan read the note twice, her mind racing. Someone had known. They would come this way. Someone had set up the beacon as a signal. Someone was helping them, but who was L? She pocketed the note and quickly searched the cabin. The root cellar turned out to be a trap door hidden under a rug, leading to a small underground storage space. Inside, she found exactly what they needed: preserved food, medical supplies, clean clothes, even a detailed topographical map of the region. Gathering what she could carry, Morgan returned to the door and flashed her light 3 times in the direction where she'd left her children, their signal that it was safe to approach. Minutes later, Jake and Leah stumbled onto the porch, exhaustion evident in every movement. "What is this place?" Jake asked, looking around the cabin's interior with wary curiosity. "A safe house," Morgan replied, showing them the note. "Someone knew we'd come this way, someone who knows about the Blackwells and wants to help us." "Who's Lil?" Leah asked, lowering herself gratefully onto one of the chairs. "I don't know," Morgan admitted, "but whoever it is knew my name and left supplies specifically for us." Jake examined the emergency beacon. "This is military tech, not something you'd pick up at a camping store." Morgan nodded, that detail having caught her attention as well. Whoever L is, they have resources, and they know these mountains well enough to predict our route. While Jake secured the door and windows, Morgan turned her attention to Leah's ankle. The infection had definitely taken hold. The skin was hot to the touch, with angry red streaks extending upward from the initial injury. Among the medical supplies, in the root cellar, Morgan had found a bottle of broad-spectrum antibiotics. She read the instructions carefully, then gave Leah the appropriate dosage with water from a canteen. "This should help," she said, rewrapping the ankle with clean bandages. "There's canned food, too. You both need to eat." As her children ate ravenously, their first real meal in 2 days, Morgan studied the map she'd found. It showed not only the standard trails and access roads, but also unmarked paths and notations that wouldn't appear on commercially available maps. One route in particular had been highlighted, a winding path that avoided major roads, but led eventually to a location marked simply as Sanctuary on the outskirts of Missoula. "Whoever left this wants us to follow this route," she murmured, tracing the path with her finger. "Are we going to trust this L person?" Jake asked, mouth full of canned peaches. Morgan hesitated. Trust didn't come easily after what they'd been through, but their options were limited. Leah needed proper medical care. They needed a safe place to recover and plan their next move. "We don't have much choice," she finally said. "Leah can't keep going cross-country with that infection, and the Blackwells are still out there searching." "What if it's a trap?" Jake persisted. Morgan spread the map on the table, tapping a particular section. "If it is, we'll know before we reach the end. See these checkpoints marked along the route? We can evaluate each one as we reach it. If anything seems wrong, we can still cut across to Highway 12 here or here." She sat back, studying the beacon's rhythmic light as it swept the cabin's interior. There was something familiar about its pattern, not random or standard emergency protocol, but deliberate. "Wait a minute," she whispered, watching more intently. The pattern repeated, 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short again. "That's Morse code," Jake recognized, watching alongside her. "SOS. Not just SOS," Morgan corrected, her heart racing. "There's more to it." She grabbed a pencil and paper from her pack and began noting the pattern as it continued past the initial SOS. After several minutes, she had the complete message. "SOS Reynolds. Safe passage follow map trust Lancer." "Lancer," Leah repeated, testing. "The name. That's our L." Morgan nodded slowly, the name triggering a distant memory. David mentioned someone with that call sign once, a former military contact who specialized in remote astronomical installations, someone who worked with classified satellite systems. "Dad knew this person?" Jake asked, surprised. "I think so." Morgan rubbed her temples, trying to recall details from conversations years past. "David consulted on some government projects before we were married. He never talked much about it, classified work. A new possibility dawned on her. Perhaps their star charts had revealed more than just mineral deposits. Perhaps they had stumbled onto something with national security implications, something that would explain both the Blackwells' extreme actions and this mysterious assistance. She folded the map carefully, tucking it into her jacket alongside. The note, "We'll rest here tonight. Tomorrow we follow the map to the first checkpoint. If it checks out, we continue to Sanctuary." Jake nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Leah had already dozed off at the table, the combination of food, medication, and exhaustion overwhelming her. Morgan gently guided her daughter to the cot in the corner, covering her with a blanket from the root cellar. Jake made himself comfortable, on the floor nearby, using his pack as a pillow. "Get some sleep," Morgan told him. "I'll take my first watch." When their breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, Morgan returned to the door, cracking it open to scan the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, the Blackwells were still searching for them. Somewhere out there, this Lancer was apparently tracking those same men, creating space for Morgan and her children to escape. She didn't know if she could trust this mysterious ally, but for now they had shelter, supplies, and a path forward. It was more than they'd had since fleeing the burning observatory. It was perhaps enough to keep hope alive. Morgan's fingers found the brass eyepiece in her pocket, its familiar weight grounding her. In the stars above, patterns remained constant. Even as everything on Earth changed, navigate by what endures, David always said. Find your fixed points. She closed the door softly and settled into the chair facing it, ready for whatever the night might bring. Dawn arrived with a clarity that only mountain air can provide. Morgan had dozed in the chair. Dawn arrived with a clarity that only mountain air can provide. Morgan had dozed in the chair, despite her intention to keep watch, the exhaustion of their journey finally claiming her. She woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar. Surroundings before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Jake was already awake, methodically organizing the supplies they'd found in the root cellar into 3 backpacks. He worked silently, his movements precise, his expression focused in a way that reminded Morgan painfully of David. "How's Leah?" she asked softly, glancing toward the cot where her daughter still slept. "Fever's down," Jake reported. "I checked her ankle. The swelling's better too." Morgan nodded, relief washing through her. "The antibiotics are working." She joined him at the table, inspecting his work. He'd been through. Each pack contained food, water, basic medical supplies, and a small emergency kit with matches and a compass. "You divided everything evenly," she observed. Jake's expression hardened slightly. "In case we get separated, we each need to be able to survive on our own." The pragmatism in his voice, so adult, so calculated, made Morgan's heart ache. At 15, he should be worrying about homework and sports, not wilderness survival and hostile pursuers. "We're staying together," she assured him, squeezing his shoulder. "But you're right, it's smart planning." She turned her attention to the map, spreading it on the table and tracing the route marked for them. According to the notations, the first checkpoint was approximately 7 miles northeast, a location marked as Hunter's Cabin. "We should be able to reach it by midday if we leave soon," she calculated, even moving slowly for Leah's sake. Jake nodded, continuing his preparations. "I found something else in the root cellar." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small handheld radio. "It was hidden behind some cans. There's a note with it. Says to use channel 16 at the next checkpoint." Morgan examined the device. A high-end tactical radio with encryption. Capabilities far more sophisticated than typical civilian equipment, the kind used by special forces or intelligence operatives. "This Lancer person is definitely military," she murmured. Leah stirred on the cot, blinking groggily as she woke. "What time is it?" "Just after sunrise," Morgan told her, moving to check her temperature with the back of her hand. "How do you feel?" "Better," Leah admitted, cautiously flexing her injured ankle. "Still hurts, but not as much. And I'm starving." Morgan smiled. Hunger was a good sign. "Jake's already packed us breakfast. Think you can walk today?" Leah nodded, determinedly. "I'll manage." They ate quickly, preserved fruit, jerky, and protein bars from their newfound supplies. As they prepared to leave, Morgan studied the emergency beacon one last time. Its steady blue-green light had guided them to safety in the darkness. Now, in daylight, it seemed almost ordinary, just a piece of equipment on a dusty table. "Should we take it with us?" Jake asked. Morgan considered, then shook her head. "Leave it running. If this Lancer comes back, they'll know we've been here and moved on." Before departing, she wrote a brief note of her own. "Following your map. Thank you. Reynolds." She placed it beside the beacon, then shouldered her pack. The day was cool and clear as they left the cabin. Perfect hiking weather. Leah moved, slowly but steadily, using a walking stick Jake had fashioned for her. The antibiotics had clearly helped. Color had returned to her cheeks, and the dull glaze of fever had left her eyes. Morgan led them northeast, following the route marked on the map. It kept them below the ridgelines where they might be spotted, but above the valley floors where vehicles could travel. A middle path, difficult to access but offering good visibility of their surroundings. The terrain was challenging but not impossible. Rocky slopes gave way to alpine meadows dotted with late summer wildflowers, then patches of dense forest where sunlight filtered through in dappled patterns. In another context, it would have been a pleasant hike through some of Montana's most beautiful wilderness. As they walked, Morgan found herself repeatedly scanning the sky, the ridgelines, the forest around them, not just for threats, but for signs of their mysterious benefactor. Was Lancer watching them even now? The thought was both comforting and unsettling. "Mom," Jake said quietly after they'd been hiking for about 2 hours, "I've been thinking about the observatory data." Morgan glanced at him, curious. "What about it?" Dad's anomaly, the gravitational distortion that suggested mineral deposits. What if it wasn't just any mineral? What if it was something important? Morgan had been considering the same possibility. "You're thinking of something strategic, rare earth elements maybe," Jake nodded. "The US imports most of its rare earth metals. If Dad found a major domestic deposit, it would be worth billions." Leah chimed in, limping alongside them. "And it would have national security implications." "Which might explain our military friend's interest," Morgan concluded, "but not why the Blackwells would go to such extremes. They're criminals, yes, but destroying an observatory and hunting us through the wilderness, that's a major escalation even for them." They fell silent, each contemplating the puzzle of their situation as they continued their journey. Around midday, as Morgan had predicted, they approached the location marked as Hunter's Cabin on their map. Unlike the previous night's sanctuary, this structure was truly primitive, little more than a 3-sided shelter built against a rock face with a crude stone fire pit in front. But it offered a place to rest, and more importantly, it confirmed they were on the correct path. "Check for supplies," Morgan instructed as they approached cautiously. "But be careful. This place isn't as secure as the last one." Jake searched the shelter while Leah rested her ankle. Morgan kept watch, scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit or surveillance. "Found something," Jake called, emerging with a small metal box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. He handed it to Morgan, who opened it carefully. Inside lay another note, a small USB drive, and a key with a numbered tag. The note was brief. "Data confirms suspicions. Key is for the vehicle at the next checkpoint. L." Morgan examined the USB drive. "We can't access this until we reach somewhere with a computer." "What data?" Leah asked. "Our observatory readings?" "Maybe," Morgan said. "Lancer's own analysis." She pocketed both items and checked the time. "We should use the radio now. Channel 16, like the note said." Jake handed her the radio. Morgan turned it on, switched to the specified channel, and pressed the transmit button. "This is Reynolds," she said simply, "at checkpoint 1. For several seconds, there was only static. Then a voice responded, male, deep, with a slight accent Morgan couldn't quite place. Reynolds confirmed. "Proceed to checkpoint 2 by nightfall. Satellite shows search patterns converging on your previous location. Move quickly." Morgan tensed. "Search patterns, can you clarify?" "Blackwell vehicles moving in grid formation, professional search technique. They have external help." "Law enforcement?" Morgan asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Negative. Private. Contractors. Military background. Dangerous. Proceed with extreme caution." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving them with the implications of this new information. The Blackwells hadn't just escalated their tactics, they'd brought in professionals, likely ex-military personnel with tracking skills and equipment that would make them far more dangerous than local thugs. "We need to move," Morgan said, her voice tight. Now! They gathered their supplies hurriedly. According to the map, the next checkpoint, marked as Ridge Road, was another 5 miles northeast. 5 miles of increasingly exposed terrain as the tree line thinned with elevation. They showed determination despite the pain that flashed across it with each step. Jake stayed close to his sister, ready to support her if needed. Morgan led the way, her mind calculating distances, potential routes, and alternatives if they encountered trouble. The afternoon stretched before them, each step taking them further, from the burning observatory and closer to whatever sanctuary Lancer had prepared. But with professional trackers on their trail, the journey had become even more perilous. As they hiked, Morgan found herself watching her children with a mixture of pride and concern. They had adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience. Jake's methodical organization of supplies, Leah's determination to keep moving despite her injury. They were changing, hardening in ways that both impressed and saddened her. This wasn't the life she had envisioned for them when she and David built the observatory. They were supposed to grow up surrounded by science and discovery, not fighting for survival in the wilderness. David would be proud of their strength, she knew, but heartbroken at the necessity of it. The sun began its westward descent, shadows lengthening across the mountain slopes. They had made good time despite Leah's injury, and Morgan estimated they would reach the Ridge Road checkpoint with about an hour of daylight to spare. "What kind of vehicle do you think the key is for?" Jake asked, as they paused to rest in the shadow of a large boulder. "Something inconspicuous, I hope," Morgan replied. "We need to blend in once we reach more populated areas." Leah took a sip from her water bottle, her face thoughtful. "Do you think Dad knew this Lancer person well?" The note said, "Data confirms suspicions," like they were working on the same problem. Morgan had been pondering this herself. David had colleagues I never met, especially from his earlier work. He always said some things were better not discussed, safer that way. "Safer," Jake repeated, a bitter edge to his voice. "Look where we are now." Morgan couldn't argue with his assessment. If David had shared more with her about his past work, about potential threats or valuable discoveries, perhaps they wouldn't be in this situation. Perhaps they would have been better prepared. But dwelling on such thoughts was unproductive. They needed to focus on the path ahead, on reaching the next checkpoint before darkness fell. "Let's move," she said, adjusting her pack. "We should be there before sunset if we keep a steady pace." As they continued their journey, Morgan found her gaze repeatedly drawn to the sky, not only to check their direction by the sun's position, but also from habit. For 20 years, the stars had been her constant companions, her field of study, her passion. Now, they were her navigation system, her lifeline in the wilderness turned hostile. She wondered what David would make of their situation, his family using astronomy not to explore the cosmos, but to survive on Earth. There was irony there, she thought, but also a strange symmetry, ad astra per aspera, through hardship to the stars. And now, through the stars, they would overcome this hardship. The sun hung low on the horizon as they approached Ridge Road. According to the map, it wasn't a road in the conventional sense, but an old logging trail that cut across the mountainside, wide. Enough for vehicles, but abandoned decades ago when the timber company ceased operations in the area. "There!" Morgan pointed to a weather-beaten wooden sign nearly hidden by overgrowth. The faded letters spelled out, "Ridge access, no unauthorized vehicles." They followed the trail for several hundred yards, moving cautiously as the day's light began to fade. The path was rutted and overgrown, but clear evidence of recent use remained. Tire tracks pressed into the soft earth, broken branches, and disturbed undergrowth. "Someone's been here recently," Jake observed, kneeling to examine the tracks. "Heavy vehicle, probably four-wheel drive." Morgan nodded, impressed by his observation skills. "Keep your eyes open. The checkpoint should be nearby." The map indicated they should look for a fork in the trail, then follow the less obvious path to the right. When they reached the junction, the difference was clear. The left fork showed signs of regular use, while the right was nearly reclaimed by nature, barely visible among the encroaching vegetation. Jake hesitated. "Are we sure about this? Looks like no one's been down there in years." "That might be the point," Morgan replied, studying the map again. "Lancer wouldn't want to use an obvious location." They took the right fork, pushing through dense underbrush that scratched at their arms and faces. Leah winced as a branch caught her across the cheek, leaving a thin red line. Morgan moved ahead, clearing the path as best she could for her injured daughter. After about a quarter-mile, the trail opened suddenly into a small clearing. At its center stood a dilapidated wooden shed, its roof partially collapsed, its walls gray with age and weather. "This can't be it," Leah murmured, disappointment clear in her voice. Morgan approached the structure cautiously. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, secured by a sturdy padlock that looked incongruously new against the weathered wood. "The key," she said, pulling it from her pocket. The numbered tag matched the digits engraved on the padlock. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Morgan pushed the door inward slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The interior was dark, but as her eyes adjusted, she made out the shape of a vehicle covered by a heavy tarp. "Jake, help me with this," she said, gripping a corner of the covering. Together they pulled the tarp away, revealing what lay beneath. Not a car or truck as they had expected, but an all-terrain motorcycle. Rugged military style, with extra fuel canisters mounted on the sides and waterproof saddlebags. "A bike?" Jake ran his hand over the matte black finish. "But there are 3 of us." Morgan examined the vehicle, noting its modifications. Reinforced. Suspension, oversized tires designed for difficult terrain. A small but powerful engine that would consume minimal fuel while providing excellent torque for mountain conditions. "It's not meant for all of us," she realized. "It's meant for reconnaissance." She opened one of the saddlebags, finding another note from Lancer. "Road ahead watched. Bike has a range of 200 miles, used to scout safe passage to the final checkpoint. Coordinates programmed in GPS. Return for family. Alternative route detailed. On enclosed map, if vehicular approach compromised." A sinking feeling settled in Morgan's stomach as she read. The note implied that one of them would need to leave the others behind temporarily, a prospect she had desperately hoped to avoid. Jake read the note over her shoulder, his expression darkening. "You're not leaving us," he said flatly. "Jake, no." His voice was firm, older than his years. "We've already lost Dad. We're not splitting up now." Leah limped to their side, reading the situation in their faces. "What's wrong?" Morgan handed her the note. As Leah read, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of a bird preparing to roost for the night. "The bike can't carry all of us," Morgan finally said, "and the road ahead is being watched according to Lancer." "So what do we do?" Leah asked, looking between her mother and brother. Morgan unfolded the new map enclosed with the note. It showed a more detailed view of the area between their current position and the final checkpoint, a location marked as Sanctuary on the outskirts of Missoula. The route was complex, crossing several roads and passing through diverse terrain. "We have options," she said, tracing potential paths with her finger. "We can continue on foot, taking the alternative route Lancer has marked. It's longer, but avoids the watched areas." "Or," Jake prompted, "or I can use the bike to scout ahead, ensure the route is clear, then come back for you two." "Absolutely not," Jake said immediately. "We stay together." Morgan understood his fear. The thought of separation terrified her too. But pragmatism warred with emotion. Leah's ankle, while improving, still slowed them considerably. The professional trackers Lancer had warned them about would be gaining ground. And night was falling, bringing both the cover of darkness and its inherent dangers. As she weighed their options, A new sound reached her ears, distant but unmistakable. The growl of engines coming from the direction of the main trail. "Inside now," she hissed, pushing her children toward the shed. They squeezed past the motorcycle, pressing themselves against the far wall, as Morgan carefully pulled the door nearly closed, leaving just enough space to peer through. Headlights appeared on the main trail, sweeping across the forest as multiple vehicles approached the fork. Morgan counted 3, large SUVs with spotlights mounted on their roofs. They stopped at the junction, and figures emerged, their silhouettes backlit by the vehicle's headlights. Even in the failing light, Morgan could make out the tactical gear, the practiced movements of men with military training. One gestured toward the right fork, their fork, while speaking into a radio. "How did they find us?" Leah whispered, her face pale in the dimness of the shed. Morgan's mind raced. They had been careful, stayed off main trails, and left minimal signs of their passage. Yet somehow, these men had tracked them to this very spot. A horrible thought occurred to her. She pulled out the handheld radio they'd found at the first checkpoint and examined it more closely in the fading light. There, nearly invisible against the black casing, was a tiny blinking light, a tracking beacon. "The radio," she breathed. "It's been leading them straight to us." Jake's eyes widened. "But Lancer gave us that radio. Or someone who wanted us to think they were Lancer," Morgan replied grimly. The implications were staggering. Had they been manipulated from the beginning? Was there no Lancer, only an elaborate trap designed to keep them moving in a predictable pattern? No, that didn't make sense. The supplies, the safe house, the medicine that had saved Leah's ankle, those were real assistants. But the radio was a problem. Morgan made a swift decision. She placed the radio on the ground and crushed it beneath her boot, silencing the tracking beacon. Then she turned to the motorcycle, evaluating it quickly. "Change of plans," she whispered. "We're all leaving now." "All 3 of us on the bike?" Leah asked dubiously. "It's designed for rough terrain with a heavy load," Morgan replied, already checking the fuel levels and controls. "It won't be comfortable, but it's our best option." Jake moved to the door, peering through the crack. "They're coming down the trail, 2 men on foot using flashlights." Morgan nodded, sizing up the interior of the shed. There was only one entrance. The hunters would arrive at any moment, blocking their escape. Unless... She studied the back wall, noting how the wood had rotted near the ground, weakened by years of moisture and neglect. Beyond it lay the forest, dark but offering concealment. "Help me with this," she whispered, moving to the weakest section of the wall. Jake understood immediately. Together they pushed against the deteriorated planks, feeling them give slightly under the pressure. A few more coordinated shoves and a section of the wall collapsed outward with a muffled crash. The noise would alert their pursuers, but it also created an escape route. "Start the bike," Morgan ordered Jake, knowing her son had experience with motorcycles from summers spent on his uncle's ranch. As Jake swung his leg over the seat and located the ignition, Morgan helped Leah through the newly created exit. The sound of running footsteps approached the shed's entrance. They had mere seconds. The motorcycle's engine roared to life, impossibly loud in the twilight stillness. Morgan didn't wait for the men to reach the door. She guided the bike through the gap in the wall, Jake controlling it at the lowest possible speed. Once outside, Morgan climbed on behind Jake, pulling Leah up behind her. The bike sagged under their combined weight, but remained operational, a testament to its military-grade construction. "Hold on," Jake called over his shoulder as he opened the throttle. The motorcycle surged forward just as the shed door burst, open behind them. Shouts followed, then the crack of gunfire, not warning shots into the air, but rounds directed at them with clear intent. Jake zigzagged through the trees, the powerful headlight of the motorcycle cutting a swath through the darkness. Morgan clung to him, feeling Leah's arms wrapped tightly around her waist from behind. The bike bounced over uneven ground, every jolt sending spikes of pain through their already battered bodies. Behind them, the sound of engines starting told Morgan their pursuers were returning to their vehicles. The race had truly begun. "Head for the coordinates in the GPS," she shouted to Jake over the roar of the engine. "Lance's final checkpoint." Jake nodded, adjusting their course slightly as he consulted the small GPS unit mounted on the handlebars. They broke from the forest onto a dirt fire road, gaining speed as the terrain leveled out. In the darkness ahead, their future remained uncertain. But one thing had become crystal clear in the chaos of their escape. Someone had betrayed them, using the radio to track their movements. Whether it was Lancer or someone posing as their mysterious benefactor, they could no longer rely on the guidance they'd been following. From now on, they would trust only themselves, the stars, and the bond between them. Everything else was suspect. The motorcycle sped into the night, carrying them toward an unknown destiny, pursued by shadows with lethal intent. Their testing moment had arrived, and they had survived the first challenge, but Morgan knew, as the cold wind whipped past them, that greater trials lay ahead. The motorcycle tore through the night, engine roaring as Jake navigated the winding fire road with a skill that belied his 15 years. Morgan clung to him, her body acting as a buffer between her children, absorbing the worst of the jarring impacts as they sped over uneven terrain. Behind her, Leah pressed her face against her mother's back, shielding herself from the biting wind. Headlights appeared in the distance behind them, pinpoints of light growing steadily larger. Their pursuers had found the main road. "They're gaining!" Morgan shouted over the engine's roar. Jake nodded grimly, twisting the throttle to coax more speed from the motorcycle. The gap was maintained for several minutes, but the SUVs had power. The motorcycle couldn't match on open terrain. "We need to get off this road," Morgan called. "Find somewhere to disappear." Jake consulted the GPS briefly, then made a sudden decision, veering sharply onto a barely visible trail that cut into the dense forest. The motorcycle bucked and slid on the narrow path, branches whipping past them as they plunged into darkness. Behind them, the pursuing vehicles slowed, unable to follow directly. Morgan knew they would continue along the main road, anticipating where the trail might emerge. They had bought time, but not safety. For nearly an hour they wound through the forest, Jake navigating by the motorcycle's headlight and occasional glimpses of stars through the canopy above. The GPS coordinates led them steadily northeast, toward Missoula, but by a circuitous route that avoided main roads and populated areas. Finally, Jake slowed the motorcycle, bringing it to a stop in a small clearing. "We need to let the engine cool," he explained, his voice hoarse from the cold air, "and check our location." Morgan dismounted stiffly, her muscles protesting after hours of tension. Leah remained seated, her face drawn with pain and exhaustion. "How's the ankle?" Morgan asked, helping her daughter off the bike. "Throbbing," Leah admitted, "but I'll manage." Morgan studied the GPS unit, comparing their current position with the coordinates marked as Sanctuary. They had made good progress despite the detours, covering almost 30 miles. According to the device, they were now only 15 miles from their destination. "If we continue at this pace, we could reach it before dawn," she calculated. Jake was examining the motorcycle's fuel gauge. "We're running low. These bikes are powerful but not efficient. We might not make it on what's left." Morgan weighed their options. Continuing on the motorcycle meant faster travel, but increased visibility and noise. Abandoning it would make them harder to track, but significantly slow their progress. A distant engine sound made the decision for them. "They're still searching," she whispered. "We need to keep moving." They remounted the motorcycle and continued northeast, keeping to forest trails and abandoned logging roads whenever possible. Morgan studied the stars during brief clearings, in the forest canopy, confirming their direction and making mental adjustments to their route. The GPS was useful, but after the betrayal of the radio, She trusted her own navigation skills more. Near midnight, they emerged from the forest onto the bank of a swift-flowing river, too wide and deep to cross on the motorcycle. "This isn't on the map," Jake said, puzzled, comparing their position with the GPS. Morgan studied the watercourse, orienting herself by the stars visible in the clear night sky. "It's Clark Fork River," she realized. "The map is outdated. The spring floods must have changed its course." This presented a significant problem. The river blocked their direct route to the coordinates, and following it upstream or downstream would add miles to their journey. "There should be a bridge somewhere," Leah suggested, pointing at the GPS. "Look, there's a road crossing about 2 miles north." "Too obvious," Morgan replied. "That's exactly where they'll be watching." As they debated their options, the motorcycle's fuel warning light began to blink, a silent reminder that time was running short. "We abandon the bike," Morgan decided. "Find a place to hide it, then cross the river on foot." Jake looked ready to protest, but nodded reluctantly. They pushed the motorcycle into a dense thicket, covering it with branches and undergrowth. It wouldn't withstand close inspection, but it might escape casual observation. The river posed its own challenge. Even at its narrowest point nearby, the water was dark and swift, its depth uncertain. "We need to find a crossing point," Morgan said, leading them along the bank. "Something shallow or with stepping stones." They moved cautiously, the moonlight providing just enough illumination to avoid pitfalls. After half a mile, they discovered what they needed. A section where the river widened and slowed, its depth reduced to perhaps 3 feet at the center. "We'll cross here," Morgan decided, removing her pack and holding it above her head. "Stay." In close together, "Jake, you help Leah." The water was shockingly cold, numbing their legs almost instantly. The current tugged at them, threatening to sweep them downstream with each careful step. Halfway across, Leah slipped on a submerged rock, gasping as she fell forward into the water. Jake caught her arm, steadying her before she could be carried. Away, soaked and shivering, they reached the opposite bank. With no way to build a fire without risking detection, they had to rely on physical movement to ward off hypothermia. They jogged slowly through the forest, their wet clothing clinging uncomfortably to their bodies. "The coordinates are 3 miles east," Morgan said through chattering teeth. "We need to keep moving." The land began to change as they progressed. The wild forest gradually gave way to abandoned farmland, overgrown fields bordered by dilapidated fences. Signs of civilization appeared. An old tractor rusting in a field, a collapsed barn, power lines strung along a distant road. "We're getting close to the outskirts of Missoula," Morgan observed. "We need to be more cautious now." They moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding open spaces where moonlight might reveal their presence. According to the GPS, they were now less than a mile from the coordinates marked as sanctuary. What awaited them there? After the revelation of the tracking device, Morgan couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into another trap. Yet they had no alternative. They were exhausted, injured, and in desperate need of shelter. The GPS led them to a narrow dirt road winding between abandoned fields. As they followed it, a structure appeared in the distance, a large 2-story farmhouse set back from the road, surrounded by ancient oak trees. A single light burned in an upstairs window. "That's it," Morgan whispered, checking the coordinates one final time. "That's the sanctuary." They approached cautiously, using the trees for cover. The property appeared well maintained, despite its remote location. The gravel driveway was neatly bordered, the wooden fence recently painted. No vehicles were visible, and no security lights illuminated the grounds. "It looks normal," Jake said suspiciously. "Too normal." Morgan shared his concern. After everything they'd experienced, normality seemed like the greatest deception of all. "We circle it first," she decided. "Look for signs of surveillance or security." They spent 20 minutes examining the property from all angles. There were no cameras they could detect, no motion sensors, no obvious security measures. Just a farmhouse standing alone in the moonlight, a single window illuminated. "What do we do?" Leah asked, her voice tight with pain and fatigue. The crossing had aggravated her ankle, and she was leaning heavily on Jake for support. Morgan studied the house, weighing risk against necessity. They needed shelter, medical attention for Leah, and information about who was hunting them and why. This sanctuary might provide those things, or it might be the final step in an elaborate trap. "We approach the back door," she said finally. "If anything seems wrong, we retreat immediately." They moved slowly across the open yard, tense and alert. The back porch creaked beneath their weight as Morgan raised her hand to knock on the door. Before her knuckles could make contact, the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, tall, lean, with silver streaks dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but his posture betrayed military training. "You're late," he said simply, his voice a deep baritone. "I expected you hours ago." Morgan tensed, ready to turn and run. "Who are you?" The man studied her for a moment, then stepped aside, revealing the interior of the house. "The name's Lawrence. Carter, former Special Forces, now independent contractor. Your husband called me Daniel Lancer." "Lancer," Morgan breathed. "You knew David?" Carter nodded. "We worked together on classified projects. He contacted me 3 months ago and said he'd found something in his star charts that concerned him. He gestured for them to enter. You should come inside. You're still being hunted." Morgan hesitated, unwilling to trust after their recent betrayal. Carter seemed to understand her reluctance. "The radio had a tracker. I know it wasn't mine. Someone intercepted my supply cache and modified the equipment. I've been trying to warn you, but they've been jamming my frequencies." "How do we know you're really Lancer?" Jake challenged, standing protectively beside his mother. Carter reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a brass telescope. "Eyepiece, identical to the one Morgan carried. David gave it to me years ago," he explained. "Said if anything ever happened to him, I should use it to identify myself to you. He knew you'd recognize it." Morgan's hand went to her own eyepiece, still safe in her jacket pocket. The matching pair. David had commissioned them specially, one for himself and one for her, with their wedding date engraved inside the rim. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand for Carter's piece. He handed it over without hesitation. Morgan examined it, finding the engraving she expected, not her wedding date, but a set of coordinates. The location of their first observatory, the one they'd built together before the children were born. "It's genuine," she said quietly, returning it to Carter. "David would have given this only to someone he trusted implicitly." Carter nodded. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. But right now, you need to come inside, all of you." "We don't have much time," Morgan made her decision. With a nod to her children, she stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the farmhouse. Jake followed, supporting the limping Leah. The door closed behind them, sealing them within the sanctuary they had fought so hard to reach. Whether it would prove to be their salvation or merely a brief respite in an ongoing nightmare remained to be seen. But for now, they had found shelter, and perhaps an ally who could help them understand why the stars had led them into such peril. The interior of the farmhouse was unexpectedly modern. Behind the rustic exterior lay state-of-the-art technology. Monitors lined one wall of what had once been a living room, displaying satellite imagery, topographical maps, and what appeared to be real-time surveillance of the surrounding area. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Carter said, securing the door behind them. "It's not much, but it's off the grid and secure." Leah collapsed into a nearby chair, her face pale with exhaustion. Jake remained standing, his posture tense, eyes darting around. The room assessing potential threats and exits, a habit he'd developed during their days on the run. "Leah needs medical attention," Morgan said. her voice leaving no room for argument. Carter nodded. Bathrooms upstairs, first aid supplies in the cabinet. Better than what you'd find in most emergency rooms. He glanced at Leah's ankle. Infection. Yes, but the antibiotics helped. She needs fresh bandages and rest. I'll show you, Carter offered, but Morgan shook her head. Jake will help me. You'll explain everything when we come back down. It wasn't a question, and Carter didn't treat it as one. He simply nodded, understanding her caution. Upstairs, the bathroom was indeed well stocked. Morgan and Jake worked together to clean and rebandage Leah's ankle, applying antibiotic ointment and giving her more medication from the extensive supplies. The swelling's better, Morgan observed, relief evident in her voice. No more red streaks. Small victories, Leah murmured, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. While Leah rested on a bed in an adjacent room, Morgan and Jake returned downstairs to find Carter in the kitchen, preparing hot drinks and food. You all need calories and hydration, he said, setting mugs of steaming chocolate on the table alongside plates of sandwiches. Eat first, then we talk. Despite her burning questions, Morgan couldn't argue with this logic. They ate in silence, the simple food tasting impossibly good after days of survival rations. Jake devoured 3 sandwiches in quick succession, his body demanding fuel after their ordeal. When they had finished, Carter led them back to the monitor-filled room. He gestured for them to sit, then took a position where he could see both them and the displays showing the property's perimeter. I've known your husband for 15 years, he began without preamble. We met during a classified defense project involving satellite-based observational systems. David was a consultant. His algorithms for tracking celestial objects were adaptable for terrestrial surveillance. Morgan nodded slowly. This aligned with what little David had shared about his work before they met. When the project ended, we stayed in touch, occasionally collaborated on other classified work. Then, 3 months ago, he contacted me. Said he'd detected something unusual in his star mapping data. Carter tapped a keyboard, bringing up an image on the central monitor, a star chart with overlays of gravitational measurements. Morgan recognized it immediately as David's work. He was mapping gravitational anomalies, she explained, using starlight distortion to detect dense matter. Yes, Carter confirmed, a technique he pioneered, but what he found wasn't just evidence of mineral deposits as you suspected. It was something far more concerning. Jake leaned forward. What did he find? Carter's expression grew grave. Evidence of unauthorized underground construction, massive excavation and reinforced structures hidden beneath your property and the surrounding wilderness. Construction? Morgan repeated, confused. For what purpose? That's what David was trying to determine when he died. Carter's voice softened. His official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but he contacted me the day before, saying he believed he was being followed. A cold wave washed through Morgan's body. Are you suggesting David was murdered? Carter finished grimly. Yes, I believe so. And I think the Blackwells were involved, though they're merely the visible part of a much larger operation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morgan's hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to hide the reaction. Jake's face had hardened into a mask of barely contained fury. Why? He demanded. Why would they kill Dad over underground construction? Carter turned to one of the monitors, pulling up what appeared to be military schematics. Because what's being built isn't authorized by any legitimate government agency. It's a black site, specifically a hardened communications and control center with direct satellite uplinks. Morgan's scientific mind raced ahead. A private intelligence operation? Worse, Carter replied. Based on what David discovered and what I've learned since, we believe it's a rogue operation run by former intelligence officers who've gone into business for themselves. They're building a facility capable of intercepting and potentially controlling Military and civilian satellite systems, controlling satellites. Jake looked skeptical. Is that even possible? With the right equipment and expertise, yes, Carter explained. Controlling a satellite network means controlling communications, navigation systems, surveillance capabilities, power that nations would pay billions to access, or that could be used for extortion on a global scale. The enormity of the situation began to dawn on Morgan. This wasn't just about land rights or mineral deposits. This was a national security threat of the highest order. The Blackwells, she said, thinking aloud. They're the local muscle, providing cover and security while this facility is being built. Carter nodded. And your observatory was perfectly positioned to detect the construction through David's gravitational mapping technique. When he started asking questions, he became a threat, and after he was... Morgan couldn't bring herself to say the word. After he was gone, why come after us? Why not just let us continue operating the observatory without his expertise? Because of you, Carter said simply. David told me you understood his work better than anyone, that you could see patterns in the stars that others missed. They couldn't risk you continuing his research and discovering what they were building. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on Morgan like a physical force. David hadn't died of natural causes. He had been silenced because of his discovery, and now the same people were hunting her and their children. All this time, she whispered, emotion finally cracking through her careful composure. I thought I lost him to fate, to bad luck, to a heart condition we didn't know about. Jake moved to her side, his hand finding hers. Mum! That single word, so simple, so laden with shared grief, broke something inside her. For the first time since fleeing the burning observatory, Morgan allowed her tears to fall. Not the few, silent drops she had permitted herself during their journey, but deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Jake held her, his own eyes wet. All the fear, grief, and exhaustion of the past days poured out of Morgan in that moment. The burden of keeping her children alive, of maintaining strength when she felt none, of processing this new, terrible truth about David's death. Carter watched in silence, understanding the necessity of this release. When Morgan's suns finally subsided, he spoke again, his voice gentle. David suspected something like this might happen. It's why he contacted me, why he gave me the coordinates to your observatory and the eyepiece to identify myself. He was preparing contingencies to keep you safe. Morgan wiped her eyes, drawing a deep, steadying breath. He never told me any of this. He was trying to protect you, Carter said. Compartmentalization is the first rule of security. If you didn't know, you couldn't accidentally reveal anything. But in the end, it left us vulnerable, she replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. We had no idea what we were facing. Carter's expression softened with regret. I should have reached you sooner. After David died, I tried to make contact. But they were watching your observatory too closely. By the time I established a secure approach, they had already made their move. Jake had been sitting quietly, processing everything. Now he looked up, his eyes reflecting a maturity beyond his years. What happens now? We can't just let them get away with this, with what they did to Dad, with trying to kill us. No. Carter. Agreed, we can't and we won't. Morgan straightened, wiping away the last of her tears. The emotional release had not weakened her resolve, but crystallized it. David had been taken from them, not by chance, but by deliberate action. The people responsible were still out there, still building their illegal facility, still hunting her family. We need evidence, she said, her scientific mind reasserting itself. Concrete proof of what they're doing and who's behind it. That's what I've been working towards, Carter confirmed. But there's a critical piece missing, the original data from David's observations, the complete gravimetric analysis that shows the exact location and scale of the underground facility. The USB drive, Morgan realized, reaching into her pocket for the small device Jake had salvaged from the observatory. This might have what we need. Carter's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the drive. You managed to save it? Their men were thorough in destroying your equipment. Jake grabbed it before we fled, Morgan explained, a hint of pride entering her voice. My son has good instincts. For the first time, Jake smiled, a small, fleeting expression that nonetheless transformed his face, making him look momentarily like the teenager he was rather than the survivor he'd been forced to become. Let's see what's on it, Carter said, moving toward a computer set up in the corner of the room. As he inserted the drive, Morgan felt something shift inside her, the first tentative steps toward healing. David's death had not been random. Their flight through the wilderness had not been meaningless. There was purpose here and justice to be sought. She had protected her children through the wilderness using her knowledge of the stars. Now, those same stars might help her expose a conspiracy and find justice for David's death. The computer beeped as the files began to load, illuminating their faces with a soft blue glow, like starlight guiding them toward truth. The computer hummed as it processed the data from the USB drive. Morgan, Jake, and Carter watched intently as files populated the screen. Astronomical calculations, gravitational mapping data, and a series of encrypted documents. That's Dad's security protocol, Jake observed, pointing to the encryption notification. He used multiple layers of protection for sensitive data. Carter nodded appreciatively. Smart man. Do you know the decryption keys? Morgan hesitated, then pulled the brass eyepiece from her pocket. David always said the stars hold all the answers we need. She examined the inside rim where their wedding date was engraved, followed by a series of numbers that had seemed like a manufacturing code. These might be coordinates, not just a date. She entered the numbers into the decryption field. The computer processed them, but returned an error message. Not coordinates, she murmured, studying the sequence again. Something about the pattern tickled her memory. Wait, it's not literal coordinates, it's a star catalog reference. Morgan entered a modified version of the numbers, this time formatted as a celestial designation from the astronomical catalogs she and David had used in their research. The screen flickered, and suddenly the files unlocked, revealing their contents. You did it, Jake breathed, squeezing his mother's shoulder. The decrypted files contained exactly what they hoped for, detailed gravimetric analyses showing anomalous density patterns beneath the mountain range surrounding their observatory. David had meticulously documented the findings, correlating them with satellite imagery and land survey data to create a comprehensive map of what could only be a massive underground facility. But the files contained something else. Something Morgan hadn't expected. Personal video logs. With trembling fingers, she clicked on the first one. David's face filled the screen, familiar yet heartbreaking to see. He looked tired, worried, his usual easy smile replaced by a tense expression. Morgan's throat tightened as his voice filled the room. Morgan, if you're watching this, then my suspicions were correct, and I've become a liability to whoever is behind this operation. I'm recording these logs as insurance and to explain what I've discovered. Jake moved closer to his mother, his hand finding hers as they watched David outline his findings, how his astronomical research had accidentally detected density anomalies beneath their property, how further investigation revealed construction patterns inconsistent with natural formations or legitimate mining operations. At first, I thought it might be a classified government project, David continued in the recording. But after discreet inquiries through my former contacts, I've confirmed this isn't sanctioned by any official agency. Whatever they're building down there, it's completely off the books. The video cut to David, showing diagrams of satellite communication. Systems explaining how a properly positioned ground facility could intercept or even hijack control signals to orbital platforms. The technology to do this has existed for years, he explained, but it's been tightly controlled. What makes this situation dangerous is the comprehensiveness of what they're building, a facility capable of manipulating multiple satellite networks simultaneously, both military and civilian. Carter paused the video. This confirms what I've been investigating. David was right. This is a rogue operation with potentially catastrophic implications. Who's behind it? Morgan asked. The Blackwells are just local criminals. They couldn't orchestrate something of this magnitude. Carter nodded grimly. They're foot soldiers. The real power is a group called Helix Consortium, officially a private security and technology consulting firm, unofficially a collection of former intelligence operatives and military contractors, who've gone into business for themselves, selling services to the highest bidder. Services like controlling satellite networks? Jake asked. Exactly. Information is the most valuable commodity in today's world. Whoever controls the flow of data controls everything else. Morgan unpaused the video, and David's voice filled the room again. I've identified several key players, though I don't have confirmation on all of them yet. The local connection is obvious. The Blackwell family has been acquiring land throughout the county, using various shell companies to hide the pattern, but they're working for someone much bigger. The video cut to a series of photographs. Men, in business suits at various locations, satellite images of properties, financial documents showing money transfers through offshore accounts. I've traced some of the funding to a company called Stratus Technologies, David continued. On paper, they develop communications software for multinational corporations. Behind the scenes, they're channeling millions into this underground facility. Morgan froze the video on an image of a man shaking hands with Vince Blackwell. I recognize him, she said slowly. He came to the observatory about 6 months ago, claimed to be from the National Science Foundation reviewing grant recipients. He spent hours asking questions about our research methods. Adrian Wells, Carter identified. Former Defense Intelligence Agency, now Chief Operations Officer for Helix. He was assessing how much you knew, determining if you were a threat. The revelation sent a chill down Morgan's spine. This man had been in their home, drinking coffee, at their kitchen table, all while evaluating whether they needed to be eliminated. She unpaused the video, watching as David outlined his growing concerns and the precautions he was taking. I've contacted Lawrence Carter. You remember him as Lancer from my stories about the satellite project. If something happens to me, he'll help you. Trust him, Morgan. And remember our contingency plan. David's expression softened. Vulnerability, replacing the analytical focus he'd maintained throughout the recording. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I thought I was protecting you and the kids by handling it alone. His voice cracked slightly. If you're seeing this, I failed, but you won't. You see patterns in the stars that no one else can recognize, Morgan. Use that gift now. Find the patterns here on Earth. The video ended, freezing on David's face, his eyes looking directly into the camera, directly at Morgan across the divide of death. For several moments, no one spoke. The weight of David's final message hung in the air, both a burden and a gift. He had entrusted them with his discoveries, his suspicions, and his faith in Morgan's abilities. He knew, she finally whispered. He knew they might kill him, and he prepared for it. Carter nodded solemnly. David was always thorough. When he contacted me, he already had contingency plans in place. Safe houses, emergency supplies, escape routes. He hoped you'd never need them. Jake had been studying the other files from the USB drive while they watched the video. There's more, he said, his voice tight with emotion. Dad mapped the entire facility. He even identified potential access points. He brought up a three-dimensional model showing a complex of tunnels and chambers beneath the mountain range. One section was highlighted in red, with notes indicating unusual electromagnetic readings and power consumption. That must be the control center, Carter observed, the heart of their operation. Can we use this to stop them? Leah asked from the doorway, where she'd been standing unnoticed, leaning on the frame for support. Her face was pale but determined, her injured ankle wrapped in fresh bandages. Carter considered the question carefully. This is compelling evidence, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. Helix has connections throughout government and law enforcement. If we approach the wrong people, this evidence could disappear, and so could we. Then who can we trust? Morgan asked. I have contacts, former colleagues who stayed on the right side of the line, people who can make sure this reaches those with the authority and integrity to act on it. Carter studied the facility schematics. But evidence alone isn't enough. We need to disrupt their operation before it goes fully online. Jake's expression hardened with resolve. You mean sabotage? Carter nodded. Precisely, and for that, we need to get close to the facility. Back to the observatory, Morgan realized, or what's left of it. It's too dangerous, Leah protested. They're still hunting us. Morgan turned to her daughter, seeing not the injured girl who had limped through the wilderness, but the brilliant young woman who had inherited both her parents' scientific minds. They are, but they're looking for fugitives trying to escape. They won't expect us to return. The element of surprise, Carter agreed. It's risky, but it might work. Morgan studied the facility schematics, her astronomer's mind mapping distances and vectors, calculating trajectories not of celestial bodies, but of their own perilous mission. We'll need to approach from the North Ridge, she said, pointing to a section of the map. It's the steepest terrain, which means it will be the least guarded. You've already memorized the layout, Carter observed, with a hint of admiration. Morgan nodded. Spatial memory. It's how I map the stars. Jake had been quiet, lost in thought, as he processed everything they'd learned. Now he looked up, his expression a mix of determination and fear. Dad knew they might kill him, but he still pursued this. He didn't run. No, Morgan agreed softly. He didn't. Then neither should we, Jake concluded. We finish what he started. The room fell silent as they all contemplated what that commitment meant. They weren't just seeking safety anymore. They were actively moving toward danger, toward confrontation with the people who had destroyed their home and likely taken David's life. We'll need supplies, Carter said, breaking the silence. Equipment for the approach, and a solid extraction plan. Morgan looked around at her children, Jake standing tall despite his exhaustion, Leah determined despite her injury, and felt a surge of fierce pride. They had survived the wilderness using nothing but their wits and her knowledge of the stars. Now they would use that same knowledge to expose a conspiracy and honor David's final work. When do we leave? She asked. Carter checked the monitors, showing the property's perimeter. Dawn. We'll use the cover of early morning fog in the valley. For now, you all need rest. As they prepared for a few hours of sleep before their mission, Morgan found herself drawn back to the frozen image of David on the screen. She touched the monitor gently, her fingers tracing the outline of his face. I see the pattern now, she whispered to him, and I won't fail. Dawn crept over the eastern horizon in a wash of pale gold and pink. Morgan stood on the porch of the farmhouse, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands as she watched the first light touch the distant mountains. Somewhere among those peaks lay the ruins of her observatory, her home, and beneath them the facility that had cost David his life. The door opened behind her, and Carter joined her, his own mug in hand. He'd spent most of the night preparing for their mission, gathering equipment, plotting routes, making secure calls to trusted contacts. "Beautiful sunrise," he commented, his voice rough with fatigue. Morgan nodded. "From an astronomical perspective, it's just the Earth rotating to reveal the sun, but David always said that didn't make it any less magical." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the light strengthen, burning away the valley. "Mist, your children are remarkable," Carter said finally. "Jake's been studying the terrain maps all night. Leah's rigged communications equipment with parts I didn't even know I had. They've inherited both your resilience and David's ingenuity." Pride warmed Morgan's chest. They've always been exceptional, but this journey has transformed them. 3 days ago, they were students, focused on homework and college applications and normal teenage concerns. Now they're warriors, Carter finished. "Like their mother." Morgan shook her head slightly. "I'm not a warrior. I'm an astronomer who can navigate by the stars. You led your children through the wilderness, pursued by armed men. You kept them alive, kept them moving, made impossible decisions under pressure." Carter's gaze was steady, respectful. "That's what warriors do." Before Morgan could respond, the door opened again as Jake and Leah emerged. Both looked different. This morning, rested, clean, and wearing fresh clothes provided by Carter. But the change went deeper than appearance. There was a new steadiness in their movements, a clarity of purpose in their eyes. "The fog's perfect," Jake observed, surveying the mist-shrouded valley. "It'll provide cover for our approach." Leah tested her weight on her injured ankle, nodding with satisfaction at its improved condition. "The swelling's almost gone." "I won't. Slow us down." Carter led them inside to a table where he'd laid out their equipment. "We'll take my truck to within 3 miles of the observatory site, then proceed on foot. Each of you needs to carry essential gear only: communications, navigation, and basic survival equipment in case we get separated." He handed each of them small earpieces. "These operate on encrypted frequencies. They'll allow us to communicate without broadcasting our position to anyone monitoring standard channels." Next came compact GPS units with pre-programmed coordinates. "These are passive receivers only. They don't transmit signals that could be detected. They'll help you navigate if we're separated, but rely on Morgan's star navigation when possible. Electronics can be tracked or jammed." Morgan studied the remaining equipment: climbing gear, compact tools that could double as weapons if necessary, medical supplies, and what appeared to be small explosive charges. "For the facility access points," Carter explained, seeing her gaze linger on the explosives. "Nothing that would cause structural collapse, just enough to disable security systems and create diversions." As they packed their gear, Morgan noticed how efficiently her children worked, how they anticipated each other's needs and movements in a way they never had before. The wilderness journey had forged a new understanding between them, a wordless communication built on shared survival. Carter outlined the final details of their plan. They would approach the facility from the North Ridge, using the observatory ruins as their entry point. According to David's research, an abandoned mine shaft beneath the observatory connected to the newer tunnels of the Helix facility. "Our primary objective is to place these," he said, showing them small devices that resembled thumb drives. "They're specialized EMP units designed to disable electronic systems without damaging structural components. We need to place them at 3 key points within the facility." "And our secondary objective?" Leah asked. "Documentation," Morgan answered before Carter could. "We need to gather enough evidence to prove who's behind this operation and what they're planning. Without that, stopping this facility just means they'll build another somewhere else." Carter nodded. "Exactly. We'll carry specialized cameras and data collection devices. Everything we document will upload automatically to secure servers if we have connectivity, or store locally if we don't." As final preparations were made, Morgan found herself drawn to a window overlooking the eastern mountains. The rising sun had fully cleared the horizon now, illuminating the peaks where their journey had begun days earlier. Jake joined her, following her gaze toward the distant ridgeline. "Do you think we can really do this?" he asked quietly. Morgan turned to her son, really seeing him for perhaps the first time since their flight began. In the soft morning light, she could see both the boy he had been and the man he was becoming, the determined set of his jaw balanced by the vulnerability in his eyes. "3 days ago, I would have said no," she admitted. "I would have said we're scientists, not operatives or soldiers. But now—" She gestured to the mountains they had crossed. "We've already done the impossible. We survived when everything was against us. We found help when it seemed hopeless. Because of you," Jake said. "Because you could navigate when no one else could." Morgan shook her head. "Because of all of us. Your quick thinking at the observatory, saving that drive." Leah pushed through. "Pain that would have stopped most adults. Your father's foresight in contacting Carter." She placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We're stronger than we knew, Jake. All of us." Something shifted in Jake's expression, a releasing of tension he'd carried since the night their home burned. For days, he had been fueled by fear and necessity, pushing forward because standing still meant death. Now, determination replaced. Fear, purpose, supplanted mere survival. "Dad would be proud of us," he said softly. "Yes," Morgan agreed, her throat tight with emotion. "He would be." Carter called them to the kitchen for a final briefing. As they gathered around the table, Morgan noticed how their positions had changed. Days earlier, she had stood protectively between her children and the world. Now they formed a circle, each watching the other's backs, each essential to their shared mission. "Once we enter the facility, we'll have approximately 30 minutes. Before security systems detect the breach," Carter explained. "We'll split into 2 teams. Morgan and Jake will place the EMP devices while Leah and I gather intelligence and documentation." Leah frowned slightly. "Shouldn't I go with Mom? She'll need technical support for the devices." "Jake has the physical training for what might be required," Carter said gently. "And you have the expertise to extract and verify digital intelligence. We're matching skills to objectives." Morgan watched her daughter's face, seeing the moment when professional assessment overcame emotional preference. Leah nodded, accepting the logic. "Communications check every 5 minutes," Carter continued. "If anyone fails to respond for 2 consecutive checks, the mission shifts to extraction protocols immediately. No heroics, no delays." They all nodded their understanding. The stakes were too high for individual risks. As they loaded the final equipment into Carter's truck, Morgan found herself standing beside Leah, who was securing specialized camera equipment in a backpack. "Are you afraid?" Leah asked suddenly, her voice low enough that only her mother could hear. Morgan considered the question, wanting to give her daughter honesty rather than empty reassurance. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm afraid of losing you or Jake. I'm afraid of failing David's mission. I'm afraid we might already be too late to stop whatever Helix is planning." She paused, looking toward the mountains where their journey had begun and would now continue. "But I'm not paralyzed by that fear anymore. It's just information now, a warning system to keep us alert, not a barrier holding us back." Leah absorbed this, nodding slowly. "That's what I feel too. Like the fear is still there, but it's behind glass now. I can see it, but it can't touch me." "That's growth," Morgan said, recognizing the profound change in her daughter. "That's healing." "In the middle of all this?" Leah gestured to their tactical gear and the weapons Carter was loading. "Into the truck." "How can we be healing when we're about to walk into more danger?" Morgan smiled slightly. "Healing isn't always about safety or comfort. Sometimes it's about purpose, about facing what wounded you instead of running from it." They were returning. to the place where their world had shattered, not as victims fleeing destruction, but as agents of justice seeking resolution. The symmetry wasn't lost on Morgan. Their journey had been circular, leading them back to the beginning, but with transformed hearts and minds. Carter approached, checking his watch. "It's time." They climbed into the truck, equipment secured, weapons loaded, communications checked. As they pulled away from the farmhouse, their temporary sanctuary in a world turned hostile, Morgan felt a strange calm settle over her. The stars had guided them through wilderness to safety. Now they would guide her family back into danger, but with purpose and preparation that they hadn't possessed before. Whatever awaited them at the facility beneath the observatory ruins, they would face it together, not just as survivors, but as warriors with a mission. The truck wound down the long driveway and turned north, toward the mountains silhouetted against the morning sky. Toward justice for David. Toward completion of the journey that had begun with fire and flight. Morgan's hand went to the brass eyepiece in her pocket, her talisman, her connection to David, her reminder of the stars that had saved them. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they had already achieved something profound. They had transformed fear into courage, confusion into clarity, flight into return. They had found themselves in the darkness, guided by distant light. Now they would bring that light to the shadows that had claimed David's life. The truck stopped at the edge of an old fire road, 3 miles from what remained of the observatory. From here they would continue on foot, using the dense forest for cover. As they shouldered their packs and checked their equipment one final time, Morgan studied the familiar slopes of the mountain ahead. "Different approach than last time," Jake observed, following her gaze. Morgan nodded. "Last time we were running away, now we're running toward it." Carter led them along a narrow game trail that wound through the underbrush. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals when necessary. Leah's ankle held steady, the combination of rest, medication, and determination overcoming what remained of the injury. After an hour of careful progress, they reached a vantage point that offered their first view of the observatory ruins. Even from a distance, the destruction was stark. The white dome collapsed, the main building reduced to blackened walls and exposed support beams. But what caught Morgan's attention was the activity surrounding the ruins. Vehicles were parked in what had once been her driveway. Men in construction gear moved purposefully around temporary structures that had been erected adjacent to the observatory site. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," Jake murmured. Carter raised binoculars to study the scene. "They're accelerating their timeline. Something's pushed up their operational deadline." "Us," Morgan realized. "They know we escaped. They know we might have evidence. They're rushing to complete the facility before we can expose them." Through the binoculars, she could see an excavator clearing debris from the observatory foundation, revealing what appeared to be a reinforced access hatch underneath. "That wasn't part of our original construction," she said. "They must have installed it without our knowledge," Carter nodded grimly. "Likely during renovations or routine maintenance over the years. Small modifications, nothing you'd question at the time." "How do we get past all those workers?" Leah asked. Carter pointed to the north side of the property, where the ruins of a small storage shed stood relatively untouched by the fire. "According to David's files, there's an emergency access tunnel that connects to the main facility from there. It was designed as an evacuation route for personnel if the main entrance was compromised. We just need to reach it without being seen," Morgan added, studying the terrain. The northern approach offered the densest forest cover, but it would bring them within 50 yards of the active construction zone. They retreated from the vantage point and circled wide to approach from the north. As they drew closer to the observatory site, they donned the final pieces of their equipment: tactical vests, communications headsets, and gloves. Carter distributed small devices that resembled remote controls. peripheral security disruptors," he explained in a whisper. "They'll create temporary blind spots in any surveillance systems we encounter. Effective range is 10 meters, duration approximately 40 seconds. Use them sparingly. Each has only 3 charges." They paused in a dense thicket of pines, the ruins now visible through the trees. Workers moved about less than 100 yards away, focusing on clearing debris from the main observatory building. The storage shed stood relatively isolated on the northern edge of the property. "We'll need a distraction," Carter said, studying the scene. As if in answer, a sudden commotion erupted at the main work site. A vehicle had arrived, a black SUV with tinted windows. When the rear door opened, Morgan recognized the man who emerged. Adrian Wells, the Helix operative who had visited their observatory months earlier, disguised as an NSF representative. "Perfect timing," Carter murmured. "Everyone's attention will be on the boss." While the workers gathered around Wells, Carter gave the signal to move. They sprinted across the open space, keeping low, their dark clothing blending with the shadows. Beneath the trees, Morgan's heart hammered in her chest, but her focus remained laser-sharp, her movements precise. They reached the storage shed without detection. Its back wall remained intact, though the wooden door hung askew on damaged hinges. Carter slipped inside first, followed by the others. The interior was small and cluttered with debris, but Carter moved directly to what appeared to be a standard electrical panel on the rear wall. He entered a code on a hidden keypad, and the panel slid sideways, revealing a narrow passageway with metal rungs embedded in the wall, leading down into darkness. "I'll go first," he whispered. "Morgan and Jake next, then Leah. Secure the panel behind us." One by one they descended into the earth. The passage was tight, forcing them to move carefully to avoid dislodging their equipment. After about 30 feet, the ladder ended at a small platform with a reinforced door. Carter used another code to unlock it, revealing a dimly lit service tunnel beyond. "We're in," he confirmed over their comm system. "From here, we split up as planned. Rendezvous in 40 minutes at the south emergency exit." Morgan checked her watch, synchronizing with the others. The gravity of their mission settled over her. They were infiltrating a highly secured facility run by dangerous people with the resources and willingness to kill. Yet fear had been replaced by resolute determination. "Stay safe," she said to Leah, squeezing her daughter's hand briefly. "You too," Leah replied, her eyes conveying everything words couldn't. Carter and Leah turned right, heading toward the data center where they could access the facility's systems. Morgan and Jake went left, following the route to the primary power distribution nodes where they would place the EMP devices. The service tunnel connected to broader corridors as they moved deeper into the facility. Unlike the rough-hewn mine shafts Morgan had expected, these were modern, finished spaces. Concrete floors, conduit-lined walls, LED lighting. It resembled a military installation more than a secret criminal enterprise. "Imagine building all this without anyone noticing," Jake whispered as they passed a series of storage rooms filled with electronic equipment. "That's the advantage of remote wilderness," Morgan replied softly. "No neighbors, no oversight, and enough legitimate construction at the observatory to justify equipment and personnel coming and going." They encountered their first security measure at an intersection of corridors, a camera mounted in the ceiling corner, its red light indicating active monitoring. Morgan used the disruptor device, creating a 40-second window to pass undetected. According to the facility schematic they had memorized, the first power node was located 2 levels below their current position. They found a utility stairwell and descended carefully, avoiding the main elevators that would certainly be monitored. The power distribution room was secured with both electronic and mechanical locks. Jake used specialized tools from Carter to bypass them, his hands steady despite the pressure. Once inside, they worked quickly, Morgan identifying the crucial systems while Jake placed and armed the first EMP device. "One down," he confirmed, as they secured the room behind them and proceeded toward the second target. Meanwhile, in another section of the facility, Carter and Leah had reached the secondary data center. Using equipment designed to intercept electromagnetic emissions, they were able to access the facility's network without triggering security alerts. "The system architecture is incredible," Leah whispered as data scrolled across her tablet screen. "They've built backdoor access to dozens of satellite systems, military, commercial, even private research networks." "Download everything," Carter instructed, "especially operational protocols and personnel records." As the download progressed, Leah's expression grew increasingly troubled. "There's something else here," she said, pointing to a section of code. "A countdown sequence. Whatever they're planning, it's scheduled to activate in less than 3 hours." Carter immediately contacted Morgan through their secure comms. "Timelines accelerated. They're going live today. We need to place those EMPs and extract immediately." Morgan acknowledged, increasing their pace as she and Jake reached the second power node. This one was more heavily secured, requiring both access codes and biometric authentication. "We'll need to bypass both systems," Morgan said, examining the security panel. Jake removed a specialized device from his pack, one of Carter's more sophisticated tools. "This can spoof biometric readings, but we need a baseline sample to work from." Morgan considered their options, then spotted a solution. A workstation inside the secure room had recently been used. If they could lift biometric data from its interface, using techniques Carter had taught them, they managed to extract a partial fingerprint and retinal pattern from the workstation's sensors. Jake's device processed this information, generating a spoofed credential that fooled the security system just enough to grant temporary access. Inside, they placed the second EMP device on the power distribution hub, setting its activation sequence. To coordinate with the others, 2 down, 1 to go, the most crucial and most heavily guarded. Their rendezvous time approached as Morgan and Jake worked their way toward the final target, the primary communication hub at the facility's core. This was where the satellite control systems were housed, where the countdown Leah had discovered would culminate. They met Carter and Leah at a junction of corridors near the southern emergency exit. "Did you get what we needed?" Morgan asked immediately. Leah nodded, patting her pack where the data storage devices were secured. "Everything. Personnel files, operational plans, financial records. Enough to identify everyone involved, from the Blackwells up to corporate executives and former government officials. And we found this," Carter added, showing them images on a small screen. Schematics for what appeared to be a satellite override system, far more sophisticated than they had anticipated. "They're not just planning to intercept communications," he explained. "They've developed a system to remotely override operational protocols for entire satellite networks. Once activated, they could effectively hold global communications infrastructure hostage. The implications were staggering. Such capability would be worth billions to corporate competitors, foreign governments, or terrorist organizations." "We need to place the final EMP at the central hub," Morgan said. "That will disable their override system before it can activate." Carter checked his watch. "Security rotations are due in 7 minutes. We need to move now." They proceeded together towards the facility's core, encountering increasingly sophisticated security measures as they went. Each was overcome through a combination of Carter's specialized equipment and the family's newfound skills. The central hub was housed in a circular chamber reminiscent of, ironically, an observatory. Banks of servers lined the walls, while a central control station displayed multiple screens, monitoring satellite positions and signal strengths. The room was empty of personnel, the system apparently designed to operate autonomously once initiated. "They've cleared out," Carter observed, "activated the sequence and evacuated in case something goes wrong." Jake began placing the final EMP, device while Morgan studied the control station, recognizing components similar to those she had used in her astronomical research. The satellite tracking system used algorithms remarkably similar to those David had developed for mapping distant stars. He would be furious that they corrupted his work like this, she murmured. With the final device in place, they began their retreat. The EMPs were set to activate in sequence, creating a cascading failure that would destroy the facility's electronic systems without risking structural collapse that might trap them inside. They had almost reached the emergency exit when alarms suddenly blared throughout the complex. Red warning lights flashed in the corridors, and metal security doors began closing automatically. "They've detected us," Carter warned, increasing his pace. "Run!" They sprinted toward the exit, sliding under a descending security door with seconds to spare. The emergency exit led to a tunnel similar to the one they had entered through, but emerging at a different location. A ventilation structure disguised as an equipment shed half a mile from the observatory. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, the forest around them quiet, save for the distant sound of vehicles at the main facility entrance. They didn't stop running until they reached the cover of dense trees, pausing only when they were certain no immediate pursuit followed. "Did we make it in time?" Leah gasped, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. As if in answer, a low rumble emanated from the direction of the facility, followed by the distinct sound of electrical systems failing. Lights visible at the construction site flickered and died. Vehicles stalled, their electronic ignition systems disabled by the electromagnetic pulse. "Perfect timing," Carter confirmed. "The EMPs worked. Their system is down." Morgan looked back toward what remained of her observatory, the place where she and David had built not just a research facility, but a home and a life. In its ruins lay both tragedy and triumph, David's death, but also the evidence that would bring his killers to justice. "What now?" Jake asked, his young face serious but no longer frightened. "Now we deliver the evidence," Carter replied. "I have a secure transport meeting us at the rendezvous point. My contacts will ensure this reaches people who can act on it, without being compromised." As they hiked toward the rendezvous, Morgan found herself studying the sky. The sun was beginning its westward descent, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. Soon, stars would appear, the same stars that had guided their flight through wilderness, the same stars David had devoted his life to studying. In a few hours, those stars would shine down on a world slightly different than the one they had illuminated the night before. A world where a dangerous conspiracy had been thwarted, where justice for David was now possible. "We'll build a new observatory," Morgan said suddenly, the words surprising even her. "Not here, somewhere new, but we'll continue the research." Leah and Jake looked at her, hope kindling in their eyes for perhaps the first time since their home burned. "Dad would want that," Leah said softly. Morgan nodded, her hand finding the brass eyepiece in her pocket, her talisman, her connection to David, her reminder of the stars that had saved them all. "The stars will always guide us," she said, looking up at the first evening star appearing in the twilight sky. "They led us through darkness. Now they'll lead us into light." As they walked toward their future, Morgan knew that life would never return to what it had been. They had been transformed by fire and flight, by danger and survival, but transformation wasn't destruction. It was evolution. They had emerged stronger, wiser, more connected to each other and to the stars above. Their journey had come full circle, yet led them to an entirely new beginning. And as night fell over the mountains, the stars emerged one by one to light their way forward, constant, eternal, guiding them home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.